A simple woman was kicked out of a pilot camp. Until she landed an F-22 on their training field, Emily Carter was never the kind of woman who fit into the expectations others had for her. Born and raised in the quiet, dusty town of Denton, Texas, her life was supposed to be simple, predictable. Her father, William Carter, was a local airplane mechanic who spent his days beneath the bellies of worn-out Cessnas and crop dusters, hands always stained with oil and grease. From the moment Emily could walk, she was there beside him, watching, learning, and dreaming. Other kids in town spent their afternoons riding bikes or getting into trouble by the creek. Emily, on the other hand, sat cross-legged on hangar floors, memorizing the sounds of engines and tracing the curves of wings with her small hands. Her father often told anyone who would listen that Emily had a sharper ear for engine trouble than most men twice her age. She knew the names of every aircraft parked at the tiny municipal airport. She could point out flaws in fuselage welds or detect a subtle tremor in a propeller shaft just by listening. But for Emily, fixing planes was never enough. She wanted to fly them. Not just the old tin birds that dotted the Texas sky, but the real machines, the ones that tore through clouds at supersonic speeds, with cockpits so advanced they seemed like something out of science fiction. Her bedroom walls were plastered with posters of fighter jets, and her most prized possession was a worn photograph of an F-22 Raptor cutting through the sky. People in Denton smiled politely when she talked about her dream. Some thought it was cute, others thought it was delusional. After all, girls from Denton did not become fighter pilots. They married boys from the football team, had kids, and settled into lives that looked a lot like the ones their parents had. But Emily never cared about fitting into that mold. The day she announced she was applying for the United States Air Force pilot training program, the reactions were mixed. Her father's eyes welled with pride, though even he could not entirely hide the flicker of worry. Her mother bit her lip, but said nothing. Her friends, what few she had, half joked that they would miss her when she came crashing down from her crazy ambition. And then there were others, the men who had always looked at her with that condescending mixture of amusement and disbelief. To them, this was just another silly phase she would grow out of. But Emily did not back down. She spent months preparing, physically, mentally, academically. She aced the initial written exams, passed the medical evaluations, and pushed herself beyond every limit she had ever known just to make it through the entrance requirements. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, her hands trembled as she held it. She had done it. Against every odds stacked against her, she had earned a spot in one of the most grueling pilot training programs in the world. The first day at the training base felt like stepping into a different universe. Towering jets loomed over the hangars, their metallic skins gleaming under the sun. The air buzzed with the roar of engines and the sharp bark of commands. Trainees from all over the country, most of them men, stood in perfect lines, dressed in crisp uniforms, eyes forward, expressions stone-cold serious. Emily stood among them, her presence immediately noticeable. Not because she sought attention, but because she was one of the very few women there. And perhaps because in the eyes of some, she did not belong. The sidelong glances were subtle, but unmistakable. The smirks, the whispered jokes barely concealed behind cupped hands. Even some instructors wore expressions that seemed to say, "Why is she here?" The first week was brutal. Days started at 5 o'clock in the morning, with physical training so intense that every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Then came hours of classroom instruction, a dizzying array of aerodynamics, systems theory, combat tactics, and emergency protocols. And after that, flight simulations that demanded absolute precision. But none of that fazed Emily. She knew it would be hard. She had prepared for hard. What caught her off guard was the invisible battle, the one fought not against gravity or G-forces, but against doubt. Not her own doubt, she believed in herself, but the doubt radiating from those around her. The instructors who seemed quicker to criticize her mistakes. The fellow trainees who conveniently forgot to include her in study groups. The occasional offhand remark whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Bet she will not last a month. Waste of a spot? Should have gone to someone who actually belongs here." She bit her tongue and powered through. Every mistake became fuel. every doubter a reason to push harder. Yet, beneath the surface, a small knot of unease began to form. Was hard work really going to be enough? One evening, after an exhausting day of simulation drills, Emily sat alone in the mess hall, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her hands were trembling, not from fatigue, but from the weight of knowing that no matter how flawless her performance was, some people had already decided her outcome. As she stared out the window, watching a pair of F-16s streak across the dusky sky, she whispered to herself, "I am not going anywhere, not without a fight." What she did not know then was that the real fight, the one that would change her life forever, had not even started yet. The second week of training came like a thunderstorm without warning. Emily woke up every morning before the first trace of sunlight touched the horizon. Her uniform was always perfect, her boots polished until they reflected her own determined face. Her notes were meticulous, her simulations showed progress, and every obstacle she encountered was met with the same stubborn resolve that had carried her this far. Yet, despite her efforts, the feeling of being watched, measured, and silently judged grew heavier with every passing hour. It was not the physical exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders. It was not the grueling drills or the endless memorization of aircraft systems. It was the invisible weight of expectation, an expectation that she would fail. It was written in the way some instructors paused a second longer before calling her name, in the exaggerated sighs when she raised her hand in class, in the knowing glances exchanged between some of the trainees when she walked into the room. "You are not cut out for this," he told her one afternoon after a particularly grueling emergency procedures simulation. "Some people just do not have what it takes. There is no shame in walking away before you get someone killed." She clenched her jaw, fists curled so tightly her knuckles turned white, but she did not respond. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Yet deep inside, the sting was undeniable. The atmosphere among the trainees was not much better. While a few offered polite, distant respect, most kept her at arm's length. Some masked their condescension behind forced smiles, others behind cruel humor. During a break in the hangar, one of the trainees, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Grant, chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "Careful, boys. Emily might outfly us. Or maybe she will crash before takeoff," he said, sending a ripple of laughter through the group. Emily ignored them, staring straight ahead, pretending their words slid off her like rain on glass. But they did not. Every insult, every smirk, every whispered doubt found its mark, carving small fractures into her resolve. Then came the day that would change everything. It started like any other, physical training at 5 o'clock in the morning, followed by briefing sessions and simulator drills. But as the sun reached its peak, casting sharp beams over the tarmac, Emily was summoned to the operations building. She walked in, back straight, chin high, trying to suppress the creeping anxiety crawling up her spine. Inside, seated behind a wide oak desk, was Colonel Davidson, the officer overseeing the training program. His face was unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. To his right sat Captain Reynolds, arms crossed, a thin smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Cadet Carter, take a seat," Davidson said, his voice devoid of warmth. She sat, hands folded in her lap, waiting. The colonel cleared his throat. "We have reviewed your performance over the past weeks. While you have demonstrated effort, it has become apparent that there are concerns regarding your suitability for this program." Her heart began to pound, loud enough that she could hear it in her ears. "With all due respect, sir," she managed to say, "my scores meet the minimum requirements." Davidson nodded slightly. "On paper, perhaps, but there are factors beyond mere scores. Cohesion, judgment under pressure, compatibility with the demands of this role. And unfortunately, we have reason to believe that this environment may not be the best fit for you." The words hit harder than any punch. For a moment, the air seemed thinner, her breath catching in her chest. "I respectfully disagree," Emily said, her voice firmer now, even as her hands trembled slightly. "Have met every standard. I have passed every evaluation." Captain Reynolds leaned forward, folding his hands. "Cadet Carter, this is not just about ticking boxes. This is about instinct, about being part of a team, and frankly there is concern, serious concern, that your presence has become a distraction both to yourself and to others. She stared at him, stunned by the brazenness of his words. "So, I am being removed?" she asked, barely recognizing her own voice. A thick silence followed. Emily could barely process the words. Her dreams, the ones she had fought for, bled for, were being stripped from her in an instant. Not because she failed, but because someone decided she did not belong. Because somewhere in the unspoken rules of this institution, being a woman from a small Texas town was reason enough. She stood slowly, feeling like her legs might give out. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Davidson raised a brow. "Granted." "You are making a mistake," she said. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was steady, sharp. "I do belong here. You just refuse to see it." Neither man responded. Captain Reynolds only smirked, as though this was the outcome he had expected all along. Without another word, Emily turned and walked out of the office, each step heavier than the last. As she exited the building, the sunlight seemed cruel in its brightness, mocking her as she crossed the tarmac for what felt like the last time. Around her, jets taxied, engines roared, and cadets moved with purpose, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the fact that one of their own was being quietly erased. She made her way to the barracks, packed her things with mechanical efficiency, and walked to the gate. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. In less than an hour, everything she had worked for was gone. But as the gates of the base closed, behind her something shifted. Beneath the crushing weight of humiliation and heartbreak, something far more dangerous was beginning to burn. Not defeat, not despair. Rage, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. The ride back to Denton was long, silent, and suffocating. Emily sat by the window of the Greyhound bus, watching the endless stretch of highway blur into streaks of brown and grey. Her duffel bag was shoved under the seat, containing everything that was supposed to be the beginning of her new life, but had now become little more than a cruel reminder of how quickly dreams could be dismantled. She did not cry, not because the pain was not sharp enough, but because her anger burned too hot to allow tears. As the bus rumbled over the last hill before the town came into view, the familiar sight of home, the cracked roads, the leaning telephone poles, the tiny airport with its rusted hangar, filled her chest with something she could not quite name. It was not comfort. It was not sadness. It was a question. How could something that had once felt so small now feel like the only place vast enough to hold the pieces of what remained of her? Her father was waiting when she stepped off the bus. William Carter stood leaning against his pickup truck, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. He did not ask what happened. He had always been the kind of man who knew when to speak and when silence spoke louder. The ride home was quiet. The truck's engine hummed, tires crunching over gravel roads. That led back to the house where Emily had spent her entire life. Her father did not look at her until they pulled into the driveway. "Get changed," he said finally, nodding toward the hangar behind the house. "That won't start. Could use your hands." "Got an old Piper." Emily hesitated only for a moment before nodding. She slipped into her coveralls, tied her hair back, and stepped into the space that had always felt like an extension of herself. The smell of oil, metal, and dust hit her instantly, grounding her in a way nothing else could. For hours she lost herself in the work, hands deep in the Piper's engine, wrench-turning bolts, mind quiet for the first time in days. Her father worked beside her in silence, passing tools, grunting in agreement when she diagnosed a clogged fuel line or a frayed starter wire. There were no questions, no pity, just the rhythm of the work, the rhythm that had always made sense when nothing else did. As the sun dipped below the horizon, her father finally broke the silence. "What happened?" "You want to tell me," Emily wiped her hands on a rag, leaning back against the wing of the plane. "They kicked me out," she said, the words tasting bitter. "Said I wasn't a good fit. Said a lot of things." William nodded slowly, as if he had expected as much. Easier for him to push out what they don't understand. "Figures," he muttered. "Always been." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Her father hesitated, then sighed. rubbing the back of his neck like he was wrestling with, "You remember back when I used to work over at Hawthorne Field? Before I something heavy. Started here full-time?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, you said they had you on contract maintenance for a few years." He glanced at her, then back at the open engine in front of them. "There were things they didn't talk about. Folks who didn't fit their mold, pilots who weren't from the right schools, mechanics who didn't come from the right families. Didn't matter how good you were. If you didn't match their picture, they made sure you didn't stay." Emily frowned. "Are you saying this wasn't just about my performance?" William tossed the rag onto the workbench, the fabric landing with a sharp slap. "Damn right I am. I've seen it before. You're a woman from a small town who didn't come through their pipeline. You scare 'em. You remind 'em that talent doesn't come with a pedigree." The knot in her stomach tightened. Good enough. "I thought I was paranoid. I thought maybe I just wasn't." Her father shook his head. "No, you were too good. That's the problem." For a long moment, Emily stood there staring at nothing. The anger that had simmered since the moment she walked out of that base now surged with clarity. This was not just about her failing. This was about a system designed to make her fail. "Dad," she said, her voice low but steady. What if this isn't over?" William raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" She looked toward the corner of the hangar, where an old set of avionics manuals and engine schematics were piled high. Her mind raced, connecting dots, recalling every lesson, every hour spent buried in aircraft systems. And then her gaze shifted out the window toward the sky, where the distant silhouette of the nearby airbase's radar tower blinked against the darkening horizon. "I'm thinking, I still have something to prove," she said. "But not to them, to myself." Her father studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few days, Emily threw herself into the only thing that had ever made sense: aircraft. She tore down engines, rebuilt electrical systems, recalibrated avionics, and revisited every scrap of knowledge her father had ever taught her. The more she worked, the clearer her mind became. It was not just about flying. It was about understanding every bolt, every circuit, every piece of the machine. But the real shift came late one night when, while digging through a box of old maintenance logs, Emily found something she was not supposed to find. It was a thin, faded folder marked with the insignia of the very airbase that had expelled her. Inside were detailed maintenance reports from nearly a decade ago, records of electrical faults, system failures, and unauthorized repairs done quietly to avoid grounding certain aircraft. More disturbingly, scribbled notes referenced discrepancies, being covered to avoid delays in flight schedules. Her hands trembled as she flipped through page after page of data, cross-referencing part numbers and systems. Her mind raced. Some of these faults involved critical systems, systems she had trained on, systems that, if misunderstood or mishandled, could be catastrophic. A sinking realization hit her. The culture of cutting corners, of prioritizing image, over integrity, extended far beyond her own experience. It was systemic, and worse, it was dangerous. She stared at the documents, her heart pounding. Her expulsion had never been about her capabilities. It had been about maintaining control, about keeping people like her out, people who asked too many questions, who refused to play by the unspoken rules. In that moment, something inside her crystallized. This was not just her fight anymore. This was about proving that the system itself was flawed, that capability and knowledge had nothing to do with where you were from or what you looked like, and more importantly, that sometimes the people most underestimated were the ones who understood the machine better than anyone. Emily closed the folder, her jaw set, her eyes hard. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. The morning. Light broke over Denton with the same lazy indifference it always had, painting the sky in streaks of soft amber and pale blue. But for Emily, nothing about this day felt ordinary. Her hands were stained with grease from the night before, her eyes heavy with fatigue, yet sharpened by something far more potent than rest: resolve. The folder she had discovered now sat locked in her father's old tool chest, but the questions it raised remained wide open, gnawing at her every thought. She had not slept much. Her mind refused to quiet, constantly returning to the same burning thought. She had to do something. But what? Exposing the flaws she uncovered would not erase the injustice done to her. Filing complaints or seeking legal action felt like shouting into the void. The system was built to silence voices like hers. She needed something louder, something undeniable. The rumble of jet engines in the distance caught her attention. She stepped out of the hangar, squinting toward the horizon. From where she stood, the distant silhouette of the nearby airbase was clearly visible. Even at this distance, she could make out the sleek forms of aircraft lined up on the tarmac, their silver fuselages gleaming under the rising sun. Among them, unmistakably, was the angular, predatory form of an F-22 Raptor. Her heart tightened. She had studied every schematic of that machine. She knew its flight systems, its avionics, its hydraulic layouts, not just from textbooks but from the countless hours she spent with her father, deciphering the language of flight. It was a machine built for dominance, for precision, for perfection. And yet in her mind it had become something else, a symbol of everything she was told she could never be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar voice of her father, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped beside her. Open house. "You hear that?" William asked. "Sounds like they're gearing up for the..." Emily turned to him, frowning. "Open house?" "Yeah," he nodded toward the base. "They do it every couple of years. Let civilians tour part of the base, show off the hardware, PR stuff, keep taxpayers happy." Her mind started turning before the words were even fully out of his mouth. "Can anyone go?" "Sure," he shrugged, "as long as you got ID and stay in the designated areas. They parade the old warbirds, run some demos, usually a couple of Raptors out on display too." "Why?" She did not answer immediately. Her gaze fixed back on the airbase, something sharp and electric igniting behind her eyes. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow but steady. Somewhere deep inside, a line had been crossed, an invisible threshold where fear gave way to purpose. "Just thinking," she finally said, her voice measured through away. "Maybe it's time I remind them what they..." Her father studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. He had known her long enough to recognize the storm brewing beneath her. Calm exterior. "Emily," he started, but his voice trailed off. Whatever he wanted to say, whether it was a warning, a plea, or a simple expression of concern, died on his tongue. Instead, he sighed and shook his head. "You always were your mother's daughter." A few hours later, Emily stood at the gates of the airbase, her civilian ID in hand, surrounded by families, veterans, and curious onlookers, all waiting to get a glimpse of the war machines that ruled the skies. The guards checked her credentials with barely a glance, waved her through with the same mechanical politeness they extended to everyone else. For the first time in weeks, no one was looking at her like she did not belong. Inside the base, the atmosphere was almost festive. Children ran past her waving miniature American flags, their faces painted with fighter jet decals. Food trucks lined the far end of the visitor area. Stands displayed models of aircraft, recruitment posters, and retired pilots recounting stories of dogfights long past. But none of it held Emily's attention. Her focus was singular. At the center of the display area, cordoned off by a thin rope barrier, stood the F-22. Its cockpit was closed, but the ladder was still attached, and ground crew members were circulating nearby, tending to the aircraft between demonstrations. A small sign read "Do Not Touch," but the presence of the ladder meant that at least for now the plane was being prepared for something, maybe a static display, maybe another demo flight. Emily moved closer, scanning the perimeter, mentally mapping every detail, the position of the crew, the security cameras mounted on poles, the gaps between patrol routes. She noted which personnel were armed and which were not, who was paying attention and who was distracted answering questions for tourists. Then something unexpected happened. A loud alarm sounded from the far side of the tarmac, a minor mechanical malfunction by the look of it. Ground crews scattered toward the noise, a few security personnel moving with them. For a moment, the Area around the F-22 was thinner, the attention of everyone split. Her breath hitched. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Or maybe it was something else. Fate handing her an opening she had never expected. Her fingers curled into fists. This was the moment. The line between impossible and inevitable was razor thin, and she was standing on it. She moved. Calmly, purposefully, as if she belonged there. Emily ducked beneath the rope barrier and strode toward the aircraft. Her steps were quick but measured. Too fast to be casual, but not fast enough to draw immediate attention. Her hands gripped the ladder, familiar muscle memory kicking in as she climbed toward the cockpit. No one shouted. No alarms triggered. Not yet. Her heart pounded like a war drum as she reached the canopy. Her fingers found the latch mechanism. Standard on these models, she had studied it 100 times in manuals and training simulations. With a click and a soft hiss of decompressing seals, the canopy slid open. She dropped into the cockpit, her body sliding into the seat as though it had always belonged there. Her hands moved instinctively. Battery on, APU engaged, avionics, boot sequence initiated. Her mind raced, recalling every checklist, every startup procedure. For a split second, panic clawed at her. What if there was an override? What if she triggered an automatic shutdown, or a lockdown she could not bypass? But then, as the screens flickered to life and the hum of electronics filled the air, a wave of cold clarity washed over her. This was not just metal and wires. This was a language she spoke fluently, a song she had memorized note for note. Through the canopy glass, she saw one of the ground crew finally notice. His eyes widened, his mouth forming the shape of a shout, but she was already moving. Hands on the throttle and control stick, feet braced against the rudder pedals, fingers flying across switches and toggles. Hydraulics pressurized, flight controls unlocked. The beast was waking up. The cockpit of the F-22 felt both foreign and familiar as Emily's fingers flew over the controls with a mixture of instinct, muscle memory, and sheer determination. Every system beeped, flashed, and came alive in a synchronized symphony of machinery and power. Despite the compressed panic outside the canopy, her mind was razor-sharp, free from the cloud of doubt that had hovered over her ever since her dismissal from the program. This was no longer about whether she was capable. This was now a fact. She belonged here more than anyone else ever had the courage to admit. Her eyes scanned the cockpit displays, checking systems, verifying readings. The engines were cold but ready. The fuel levels were sufficient for a demonstration flight, likely prepped for one of the air shows scheduled for later that day. Landing gear was down, brakes set, flight computers online. She gripped the throttle, her thumb hovering over the engine start switches. For a moment, doubt attempted to creep in. This was an F-22, a fifth-generation stealth fighter, a machine designed to outfly, outfight, and outthink anything else in the sky. Starting it, much less flying it, was something that even experienced military pilots approached with reverence. Could she really do this? Then her jaw clenched. She was done with doubt, done with waiting for someone else to give her permission to be extraordinary. Her thumb pressed down. Engine 1, ignition. Engine 2, ignition. The turbines began to spool, the deep whine building into a growl that reverberated through the frame of the aircraft. Her body vibrated as power surged into every system. Hydraulic pressure surged. Flight controls came alive beneath her grip, and the subtle shake of the airframe told her the F-22 was breathing now, awake, alive, and under her command. Outside, chaos erupted. The ground crew was shouting, waving, arms, some scrambling for radios. A security officer sprinted toward the jet, one hand gripping his holster, the other frantically signaling for her to stop. But she was already a step ahead. Her hands danced over the switches, disengaging brakes, powering the control surfaces, and unlocking the steering tiller. The jet rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, as she taxied toward the runway access. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her focus never wavered. Left hand on the throttle, right hand on the stick, feet managing the rudder pedals. Every part of her body synchronized with the machine as if she had been born for this very moment. A voice blared over the loudspeaker. "Stop the aircraft! Power down immediately!" The command was sharp, panicked, but distant. An irrelevant noise drowned beneath the growl of jet engines and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. As she reached the taxiway, a sudden flicker of doubt sparked, not from within her but from the F-22 itself. A warning flashed red on one of her displays. System lockout, remote security engaged. Her pulse spiked. She had expected a fight, but not this. Someone on the ground had initiated a remote lockdown designed to disable certain aircraft functions if unauthorized access was detected. For a split second, everything threatened to unravel. The engines still roared, but critical flight controls were graying out on her interface. The flight control system was locking her out mid-taxi. The plane would not fly. Not like this. But panic was a luxury Emily had never allowed herself. Her mind pivoted, scanning through every failure point, every redundancy she had ever studied about modern aircraft systems. Her father's voice echoed from deep in her memory, from long nights spent buried in avionics manuals. Every system built by men has a weak point. You just have to know where to look. Her eyes darted across the panel, searching, calculating. Then she saw it, the circuit bypass for ground diagnostic override. It was not meant to be used in flight, but rather for maintenance crews to troubleshoot avionics without full system engagement. If she could reroute the lockout signal through the diagnostic loop, she might regain enough manual control to bypass the remote block. Her hands dove beneath the console, yanking open an access panel with a quick twist of her wrist. A tangle of colored wires stared back. Her fingers moved without hesitation, stripping the protective covering from one wire, bridging it with a maintenance bypass lead, and forcing a soft reset into the flight control processor. The cockpit went momentarily dark, a terrifying heartbeat of silence where every display blinked out. Then, with a sudden surge, everything snapped back online. The lockout warning vanished. The control surfaces fluttered as they came back under full authority. Outside, two security trucks barreled toward her position from opposite ends of the tarmac, red and blue lights flashing. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands drowned by the howl of the engines. Emily pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft surged ahead, tires screeching against the concrete as the nose turned toward the runway. Her right hand eased back on the stick. Her left jammed the throttle to military power, then into afterburner. The roar that erupted shook the earth. The F-22 shot forward like a missile loosed from its rail. Tires thumped against the seams in the tarmac, acceleration pinning Emily back against the seat. Her hands were steady, her eyes locked on the far end of the runway. At 160 knots, she eased the stick back. The nose lifted. Gravity fought her for half a second and then lost. The wheels left the ground. She was flying. A sudden weightlessness filled her chest, mingled with the violent pull of acceleration. The moment her landing gear cleared the asphalt, she retracted it, pulling the lever with a sharp motion. The gear doors snapped shut, the sudden drop in, drag pushing her speed even higher. Below, the base was chaos. Sirens wailed, radios screamed, security scrambled, but it was too late. She was above them now, literally and figuratively. Her eyes scanned the HUD, reading airspeed, altitude, climb rate. The numbers climbed rapidly. 2,000 feet, 4,000, 6. She banked the jet gently westward, away from the base, feeling the machine respond to her touch as though it had waited its entire life for someone like her to sit in this seat. Every fiber of her being was alive, hyper-aware, hyper-present. Every movement of the stick, every twitch of the rudder pedals translated into a ballet of motion no simulator could ever capture. The F-22 was not just a plane. It was an extension of her body, her will. She checked her rearview mirrors. Nothing in pursuit yet. The base's response jets were likely still scrambling. She had a window. Not a big one, but enough. Her mind spun through options. She could run, punch the throttle, climb to 50,000 feet, and be out of radar range within minutes. But that was not why she had done this. This was never about escape. This was about sending a message. Her hands danced over the controls again, flipping through navigation waypoints, locating the precise grid coordinates of the very training field where weeks ago she had stood humiliated, expelled, and erased. Her lips pressed into a hard line. That was where she was going. She was not done yet, not even close. The sky stretched infinitely ahead, a boundless canvas of blue pierced only by the sleek silhouette of the F-22, cutting through it like a blade. Emily held the controls with a grip both firm and instinctive. Each movement of her hands and feet met with a response that felt almost symbiotic. Below her, the vast sprawl of countryside gave way to clusters of buildings and airstrips. One in particular burned itself into her vision, a familiar grid of runways and hangars that represented the very place where her dream had been unceremoniously dismantled. Her mind raced faster than the jet's turbines, not with panic, but with a calculation sharper than any simulation could prepare her for. This was not an act of recklessness. It was an act of precision, of purpose, of proving in the most undeniable way that the limits others had placed on her existed only in their minds. She adjusted her heading, easing the stick to bank gently left. As the training field came into view, the flood of memories was instant and visceral. This was where she had stood, weeks prior, as Captain Reynolds dissected her performance with a scalpel of condescension. This was where whispers followed her like shadows, where side-eyes and thinly veiled smirks met her at every corner. This was where her name was quietly scrubbed from the roster, as though she had never been meant to belong. But now the sound of her own engines drowned out every one of those memories. As she approached, her radar painted the airspace. No interceptors yet. Either the scramble orders were delayed, or they had assumed she was fleeing rather than circling back. A critical miscalculation on their part. She throttled back slightly, dropping altitude, her left hand flicking switches to deploy flaps and adjust the angle of attack. The roar of her engines softened into a lower growl as she eased into a controlled descent. The training field grew larger, more detailed, every tarmac line, every hangar, every parked jet now within her view. On the ground, chaos was unfolding. Vehicles screeched to a halt, personnel scattered like ants disturbed from their hill. Pilots in training suits stared skyward, mouths agape, some pointing, some shouting into radios or phones. Among them she spotted them, Reynolds standing near the command post flanked by instructors who had played their part in her downfall. His body stiffened as he followed the shape of the Raptor arcing overhead, his posture a perfect blend of disbelief and alarm. Emily smiled, a cold line tugging at the corner of her mouth. They had told her she would never fly, told her that the sky was not hers to claim. And yet here she was, a living contradiction to every limit they had tried to impose. As she executed a low pass, the Raptor thundered over the airstrip at less than 500 feet, the sound breaking across the field like a rolling explosion. The sheer force of the sonic pressure rattled windows, set car alarms screaming, and left every person below ducking instinctively as the machine shrieked past. She pulled back into a steep climb, flipped the jet into an inverted roll at the peak, then nosed back down into a controlled descent. This was not a display of defiance, this was demonstration of mastery, of control, of everything they had claimed she lacked. As she circled, her gaze swept the ground, locking once more on the familiar figure of Reynolds. His face was frozen in an expression that no longer carried the sneer of superiority, but rather the pinched rigidity of a man whose worldview had just cracked. Then, through her headset, the first voice broke through the static. Unidentified. Pilot, this is Tower Control. You are ordered to land immediately. Repeat, land immediately. You are in restricted airspace. Emily toggled the comms but did not respond. Words were unnecessary. The machine beneath her said everything that needed to be said. She adjusted her heading for another approach. This time, she extended her landing gear, the whine of hydraulics, accompanied the smooth deployment, followed by the satisfying clunk as the gear locked into place. Her hands remained steady, her breathing even, her body moving with the precision of someone who no longer questioned whether she belonged here. The runway grew larger in her HUD. Her speed dropped, flaps deployed further, air brakes engaged. She aligned perfectly with the center line, reducing throttle incrementally, letting the aircraft's glide path settle naturally. Wheels kissed asphalt in a textbook landing, smooth, balanced, authoritative. Her hands worked the throttle, and rudder, guiding the Raptor down the strip as it decelerated, the air brakes blooming behind her like metal petals. As the aircraft rolled to a halt, right at the center of the primary training field, every set of eyes was on her. Ground personnel, who had run toward the scene, now stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Security vehicles flanked the far edges of the tarmac, lights flashing but unmoving, their occupants too stunned or too confused to know whether they were dealing with a threat or a miracle. She sat there for a moment, engine humming at idle, the cockpit filled with the soft symphony of beeping systems and flowing hydraulic lines. Her reflection stared back at her from the HUD glass, fierce, composed, unapologetic. Then, with deliberate movements, she powered down the engines. The deep whine softened, then faded. Displays flickered off. The canopy release hissed as the pressure seals broke and the glass dome slid open. Emily stood, slowly removing her helmet, letting the wind sweep through her hair. The silence on the ground was deafening. 100 faces stared back at her, all struggling to reconcile the impossible image before them. The woman they had dismissed, erased, forgotten, now standing in the cockpit of one of the most advanced fighter jets on the planet, having flown it with the kind of precision few could ever hope to achieve. Reynolds was the first to move. His steps were rigid, mechanical, as he stalked toward the aircraft. His mouth worked soundlessly at first, as though trying to form words, but failing, against the sheer absurdity of the moment. When he finally found his voice, it came sharp, but cracked. "Get down from there, now!" Emily did not move, did not flinch. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. She wanted him to feel it, the weight of this moment, the collapse of everything he believed about her. Other instructors gathered behind him, some barking into radios, others whispering among themselves, their expressions a chaotic mix of disbelief, fear, and something else creeping in. Respect. Or at least the beginning seeds of it. A military police officer cautiously stepped forward, hand hovering near his sidearm but not drawing it. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am, I need you to step down from the aircraft." Emily finally moved. One slow step down the ladder, then another. Boots hit the tarmac with a thud that felt, to her, heavier than any sonic boom she had left in her wake. She stood tall, helmet in one hand, eyes scanning the crowd. Not a word left her lips, but her presence alone was deafening. For the first time since setting foot on this field, Emily Carter was exactly where she belonged. Not in spite of anyone's permission, but because she had taken it. Emily stood surrounded by attention so thick it seemed to warp the very air around her. The aircraft behind her still radiated heat from its engines, a mechanical beast momentarily silenced, but far from tamed. Around her, a semicircle of security personnel, instructors and trainees had formed, a living wall of disbelief and confusion. For several beats, no one knew who they were supposed to be in that moment. Was she a criminal, a threat, or something else entirely? Something they had never accounted for. Captain Reynolds was the first to step forward again. His face was flushed, his jaw so tight it looked like it might shatter under the pressure. His words came in clipped bursts, almost strangled by the fury barely contained beneath the surface. "You realize what you have done?" His voice trembled not with fear, but with the terrifying vulnerability of a man whose control had been shattered in front of his entire world. Emily did not answer. Her eyes never left his. She stood straight, shoulders back, chin high, her silence louder than any words could ever be. Behind Reynolds, other figures gathered, Colonel Davidson among them, flanked by senior instructors whose expressions shifted from outrage to something closer to dread. Radios buzzed, voices crackled, orders flew between personnel who seemed to struggle with the idea that what they were witnessing was real. Then came the heavy stomp of boots, military police approaching, weapons holstered but hands tense, fingers flexing against the grips. One of them, a sergeant with graying hair beneath his cap, stepped toward her. His voice was softer than she expected, controlled, professional. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to place the helmet down and raise your hands. No sudden movements." Emily did as instructed, bending slowly to place the helmet on the tarmac before straightening and raising her hands to shoulder height. But her gaze never wavered. She was not surrendering. Not really. She was choosing the terms of her next move. The sergeant gestured to his team. "Cuff her." As two officers approached with zip ties, Reynolds turned to Davidson, his voice a low, urgent snarl. "This is treason, theft of military property. She needs to be charged right now." But Davidson's eyes were locked on Emily, his mouth a hard line, his brow furrowed in something far more complex than simple anger. Hurt was calculation, unease, a recognition of the Pandora's box now wide open before him. "Sir, she flew a multi-billion-dollar aircraft without authorization," Reynolds continued, voice rising. "We cannot let this slide. You cannot—" "Shut up, Reynolds," Davidson snapped, the command cutting through the air like a gunshot. The sudden silence that followed was absolute. Reynolds blinked, stunned into silence, his mouth hanging open. Davidson stepped forward, folding his arms behind his back as he studied Emily like a scientist, encountering a species previously thought extinct. "I need to understand something," he said, voice level, controlled. "How?" The single word hung between them with the weight of 100 unspoken questions. Emily lowered her hands slightly but kept them visible. "How?" she echoed. "The same way anyone does anything. Preparation, knowledge, skill." A muscle twitched in Davidson's jaw. "You bypassed the remote lockout," she nodded once. "You initiated full flight systems, engine start, taxi and takeoff procedures, without ground clearance, without assistance, and executed a landing back on this field with no prior clearance." "Correct." Behind him, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered personnel. Even those who had stood silently now leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Davidson shook his head once as if clearing cobwebs. "You should not have been able to do that." "And yet here we are," Emily replied, voice calm as still water. For a moment Davidson said nothing, then he turned slightly, looking at the instructors behind him, at Reynolds, whose face was now a study in impotent rage, at the others whose expressions varied from stunned disbelief to dawning realization. When he spoke again, his voice was lower but carried even more authority. "Directly involved in security or command, clear the field, now." Everyone not. The order broke the trance. Trainees scattered, junior personnel backed away, the military. Police exchanged glances but remained in place, still flanking Emily but no longer looking quite so sure of their roles. Reynolds stepped forward, protesting. "Sir, this is—" "Captain, if you speak again without being addressed, you will be relieved of duty on the spot," Davidson snapped, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Reynolds stumbled back a step, jaw working furiously but words failing him. Davidson turned back to Emily. His next words were measured, deliberate. "You have put this base into a situation that I cannot even begin to quantify. Do you understand? The political, legal, and operational consequences of what you just did. I do, and you did it anyway, because you left me no other way to be heard." The colonel exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You realize that there are people already calling higher command. This is not something that will be buried." "That's the point." He studied her, searching for weakness, for regret, for anything that would signal this was madness. But there was none. What he found instead was something that made him visibly uncomfortable, absolute certainty. A long silence passed before he spoke again. "Sergeant, remove the cuffs." The MP hesitated. "Sir?" "Do it." Emily felt the plastic bindings snap free. She flexed her wrists, her skin bearing the faint indentations of the restraints, but her posture remained unchanged, unbroken. Davidson paced a step back, hands on his hips, then turned to Reynolds, who still hovered near the command post. "You told me she was unfit," the colonel said, his voice low, dangerous. "That she was incapable, that she posed a distraction, a liability." Reynolds swallowed. She just flew a damn Raptor, solo, without clearance, without aid, without even authorization to breathe near the thing. And she landed it, on this runway, clean." Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face had gone from red to ashen in the space of seconds. Davidson turned back to Emily. "I have a decision to make," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "There are two paths here. One ends with you in a cell so deep they forget where the key is. The other—" He trailed off, staring at the aircraft, then back at her. "The other recognizes that what you just did proves something no test, no simulator, no paper file ever could." Emily's gaze did not waver. "Then choose." Davidson stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, locked in the tension of a choice that could not be undone once made. And in that space, on that tarmac, surrounded by the wreckage of old assumptions and the deafening silence of shattered limits, a fault line split wide open between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to become. The hum of the engines had long faded into silence, but the atmosphere on the tarmac vibrated with a tension that felt on the brink of combustion. Emily stood like a lightning rod at the center of a storm she had created, with nothing more than sheer will, knowledge, and the refusal to accept someone else's limitations on her life. Colonel Davidson remained frozen in that space of impossible decisions, balancing between the crushing weight of protocol and the undeniable truth that stood right in front of him. Just when the tightrope seemed ready to snap, a harsh electronic tone pierced the air. Radios on the belts of several military police officers and instructors crackled to life in unison. A voice, sharp and commanding, filled the channel. "Tower to all units. Unauthorized systems breach detected. Repeat, systems breach in progress." Emily stiffened. Her eyes darted instinctively back toward the F-22 behind her. Her brain processed the message faster than anyone around her, instantly passing the implications. Whatever automated security protocol the base had built into their systems had just triggered something far beyond standard lockdown. Somewhere deep in the digital nerves of the facility, a silent alarm had escalated her actions into a full system countermeasure event. Colonel Davidson's hand flew to his radio. "Tower, clarify, what breach?" The voice replied, clipped, panicked. "Sir, remote avionics are registering as compromised. Anomaly spreading to adjacent systems. Flight line security net is cycling. We are losing uplink authority to the Raptor's diagnostic grid." Davidson spun toward Emily. His face, moments ago balanced between frustration and reluctant awe, now sharpened into alarm. "What did you do?" Emily's chest tightened. "I bypassed the remote lockout, that's it. Standard diagnostic reroute." Reynolds, smelling blood, stepped forward, sneering. Cascade failure. "This is sabotage. She has triggered a no," Emily shot back, voice rising. "No, that's not how this works. The system's fighting itself. The bypass wasn't designed for active flight interfacing. It's probably stuck in a loop trying to resolve whether the plane is in maintenance mode or combat ready." Davidson grabbed his radio again. "Tower, status report, contain it." "Negative," the reply came, strained. "Systems are bleeding across grid partitions. Hangar bay controls are offline. Transponder arrays failing. Secondary fuel control is reporting false positives for leak detection. Sir, it's spreading." A wave of realization swept over the crowd. Several personnel stumbled back instinctively from the jet, as though it might detonate purely from the chaos unfolding within its circuitry. The aircraft itself sat silent, inert, but its internal computers were fighting a war invisible to the human eye, a cascade of code, error loops, and automated lockdown sequences spiraling into a digital meltdown. Emily's hands curled into fists. Her mind raced through every schematic she had memorized, every diagnostic procedure, every line of emergency override protocol buried in the technical manuals her father had once stacked in their garage. She could see it in her head, as if it were laid out in front of her. The flight computer routing tree, the way the diagnostic bus shared bandwidth with the security modules, the inherent vulnerability that came from layering safety systems over combat-ready firmware. Davidson barked orders. "Isolate the aircraft's grid. Cut uplink power." "Negative, sir," the radio snapped back. "Fail-safe protocols have seized the main relay. Manual kill is not responding. Backup generators are cycling in error." Panic rippled through the personnel. If the grid cascaded fully, it would not just fry the F-22's onboard systems. It could take down the adjacent hangars, the tower's radar arrays, and every aircraft plugged into the shared diagnostic network. A blackout on this scale was not just a technical failure, it was a security incident that could ground the entire base for days, maybe longer. Reynolds' voice rose over the chaos. "Arrest her, she caused this, Shut up," Emily snarled, spinning toward him with an intensity that silenced even the officers nearby. Her hands flew to the access panel beneath the aircraft's fuselage, moving purely on instinct. "Get me a maintenance rig, now." No one moved. "Now!" Davidson blinked, then turned. "You heard her! Get the rig!" A technician scrambled toward the service cart, rolling it over at full sprint. Emily yanked the console cable free from its housing, flipped the emergency breaker that isolated the main avionics bay, and opened the terminal hatch. Beneath the skin of the jet, layers of wiring, fiber optic relays, and thermal regulators glowed faintly in the shadow. She needed a hardware kill, a real one. Her hands found the primary data bus coupler. With a grunt, she reached for her multi-tool, flipped the blade out and jammed it into the thermal seal, cracking the connector free. Sparks flew. The displays inside the cockpit flickered, then dimmed. The entire jet shuddered once, a mechanical gasp as its nervous system abruptly went blind. The radio crackled. Radar arrays clear. Tower grid stabilizing, hangar bays restored, fuel controls back online. A breathless silence followed. Technicians stared. Military police hovered mid-step, hands still near their sidearms, but no longer moving. Reynolds' face drained of color, his mouth moving soundlessly. Davidson slowly exhaled. "Status?" "Grid contained, sir. Isolated. Systems nominal." Emily slid out from under the fuselage, streaked in grease, sweat, soaking through her flight suit. She stood slowly, wiped her hands on her thighs and faced them all again. There. Fixed. The absolute authority in her voice was undeniable. Davidson stepped forward, taking in the scene, the silent raptor, the stunned personnel, the woman standing before him like she had just walked out of a battlefield. His expression softened by a degree, then shifted back into something unreadable. "You realize," he said quietly, "you just saved this entire base from a catastrophic systems failure." Emily nodded, chest still heaving. "Because I caused it, which means I understood how to stop it." Davidson's jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else now. Respect, or maybe the first reluctant admission of what was becoming undeniable. "Captain Reynolds," he said without looking away from Emily, "get out of my sight. You're relieved until further notice." Reynolds blinked. "Sir, you... now." The captain stumbled back, stunned into silence as he backed away into the growing crowd. Davidson turned fully back to Emily, his posture shifting. "Never be uncrossed, you know that. You have crossed lines today that can... I do. And yet you proved something that nobody here can ever deny again." Her eyes hardened. "That I belong in the sky." His gaze held hers for a long, tense moment. "Yeah, that." The air remained charged with the aftermath of chaos, but beneath it, a strange, almost eerie stillness settled over the tarmac. Emily stood alone in front of the silent raptor, her hands streaked with grease, her pulse still echoing in her ears like the fading remnants of afterburners. Around her, the circle of officers, technicians, and military police had transformed, from hostile containment to silent observation. No one knew what to say, because the lines that once seemed immovable had been shattered. Colonel Davidson paced a tight circle, one hand rubbing his jaw, the other folded against his side, clearly wrestling with something that had no precedent, no protocol, and certainly no chapter in any manual he had ever read. His boots scraped against the concrete, punctuating his thoughts in heavy, deliberate steps. His gaze kept flicking from Emily to the jet, then back again, as if the sight of either might give him some answer he could not yet form into words. Emily's mind, however, was already a dozen steps ahead. She had fought too long, climbed too high, and risked too much to freeze now. Her brain dissected the last few minutes with clinical precision, replaying each flick of her wrist, each cable severed, each system bypassed. It wasn't luck. It was something deeper, an intimate understanding, born not from classrooms or controlled simulations, but from a life lived in the marrow of machines. Her thoughts drifted briefly back to her father's hangar, to the long nights under the wing of an ancient Piper Cub, hands small but steady, learning the difference between theory and survival. One memory in particular surged forward, sharp and clear. Her father, kneeling beside her as she struggled to diagnose a stubborn alternator fault, had handed her a tiny brass component, a breaker override pin barely bigger than her thumb. "You keep this," he had said, pressing it into her palm. "One day when the manuals are useless and the computers lie, you'll remember that sometimes the difference between flying and falling is just knowing which circuit doesn't care about rules." Her fingers brushed instinctively against her pocket, and her heart caught. The pin was still there. It had been with her for years, tucked away like a forgotten talisman, a symbol of something deeper than knowledge. Intuition, legacy, resilience. The brass was warm now against her fingertips, as if it recognized the moment it was destined. For Davidson finally stopped pacing. His voice, when it came, was lower, heavier. "You should not have been able to do what you did. No one should. Not even our most advanced systems account for someone like you." Emily met his gaze. "Unwavering. Me. Or anyone like me. That's because your systems weren't designed to account for." For a few seconds, the silence between them was a battlefield. The weight of the truth neither of them could ignore pressed harder than any chain of command or flight regulation ever could. Then the radios on the belts of several officers flared to life again, this time with a different tone, an alert, sharp, and authoritative. "Command center to field control. High command inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Secure perimeter." "Repeat, secure perimeter." Davidson's face hardened. The weight behind that message was unmistakable. What had started as an internal incident was no longer contained. Brass was coming. Big brass. Decisions were about to be made on a level far above anyone standing on this tarmac. But before any of that could unfold, Davidson turned back to her, lowering his voice just enough to create a pocket of privacy amid the storm. "How you've left me no choice but to escalate. There's nothing I can do to stop what's coming. They'll either bury this or change everything, maybe both." Emily stepped forward, fingers tightening around the brass pin in her pocket. "Then let's not pretend anymore. Let's not pretend this was ever about protocol or rules or procedure. This was always about one thing, whether someone like me was allowed to fly. Whether skill, knowledge, and will mattered more than the picture you all had in your heads of what a pilot looks like." Davidson's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think this is just about you?" "No," she said, voice sharper than steel. "It's about every person who was told they didn't belong because they didn't fit the mold. It's about every locked door, every sideways glance, every time someone said, 'Not you.' I just happened to be the one stubborn. Enough to kick the door off its hinges." For a long beat he said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, a shadow of something like respect flickered across his features. "You realize if you had failed any part of this, you'd already be in chains." "I didn't fail." The words hung between them like a challenge. Undeniable, immutable. The rumble of approaching engines grew louder, a convoy of dark SUVs and armored vehicles crossing the far perimeter, tires kicking up dust as they barreled toward the flight line. Emily's breath slowed, her heartbeat steadied. This was the moment, the fight she had never asked for but had chosen anyway. Davidson sighed deeply, then straightened, his posture snapping back into full command presence. "Whatever happens next, it's not just between you and me anymore." As the convoy screeched to a halt, figures in dress uniforms stepped out, their faces stern, their eyes hidden behind polished sunglasses that reflected the world but gave nothing back. A general among them glanced once at the Raptor, then at Emily, then at Davidson, his jaw set in a line that spoke of decisions made before words had even been exchanged. Emily's hand closed tighter around the brass pin in her pocket. It had always been with her. A simple object, a reminder, a symbol. And now perhaps the most fitting metaphor for everything she was, an unassuming piece of metal that, in the right hands, could bypass any barrier. As the first officer approached, Barking the opening demand of a conversation that would decide the rest of her life, Emily squared her shoulders. She was ready. The sound of heavy boots on concrete reverberated through the tense air, growing louder with every step of the high-ranking officers now advancing toward the scene. The leading figure, a general whose uniform bore the weight of decades of service and ribbons lined like scars of battles fought in air and on paper, walked with the presence of someone who made decisions that changed careers, destinies, and entire missions with the stroke of a pen. His expression was carved from stone, lips pressed thin, eyes obscured by the reflective lenses of aviator sunglasses that turned the world into his mirror and gave nothing back. Beside him moved several colonels and majors, clipboards in hand, tablets flickering with streams of data, real-time diagnostics of the incident still unfolding across the base's internal networks. The gravity of their presence radiated outward, forcing technicians to step back instinctively, prompting security personnel to stiffen their postures as if afraid their own spines might be next for inspection. Emily stood in the eye of this storm, her body still streaked with grease, the brass pin in her pocket grounding her more than any chain of command ever could. Her gaze remained locked forward, unreadable, unmoving, as though carved from the same marble that now seemed to encase every soul watching her. The general came to a halt less than 10 feet away from her, his head tilting slightly as he surveyed the scene. The F-22 parked behind her, dark and silent now, but still radiating the aura of raw power barely restrained. His eyes shifted behind, his glasses toward Colonel Davidson, whose shoulders squared but whose mouth pressed tight, betraying tension not even decades of discipline could fully mask. Without looking at Emily, the general spoke, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the very air feel heavier. "Report." Davidson cleared his throat, his voice sharp, clipped. "General, the situation involves a breach of flight. Line protocol resulting in an unauthorized startup, taxi, takeoff, and landing of an F-22 Raptor." The general didn't flinch. "Cause? Manual override of onboard diagnostics and remote security lockout, sir." "Method?" Davidson hesitated, glanced sideways toward Emily, then back. "Bypassed through maintenance diagnostics, rerouted ground-level control systems, terminated lockdown via physical hardware isolation." There was a pause, a long one, the kind of silence that carried the weight of decisions being drafted not just for today, but for years to come. Finally, the general shifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately, toward Emily. His voice was colder than the wind cutting across the tarmac. "Name?" "Emily Carter," she answered without hesitation, standing as straight as any officer ever had, though she wore no rank on her shoulders. "Civilian?" "Former cadet, Davidson." Inserted before she could answer, his tone now threading between duty and a reluctant acknowledgement of the undeniable. "Was discharged from the pilot program 2 weeks prior to this event." The general let that sit, chewing on the fact as though it was something physically stuck in his teeth. His next words were almost mechanical in delivery, but carried the sharpness of a scalpel. "Explain." Emily's jaw tightened. Her voice, when it came, was steady, clear, without apology. "I was removed from the program under the claim of not being the right fit. I disagreed with that assessment. Today I demonstrated that assessment was wrong. A flicker of something, disbelief, irritation, or perhaps a sliver of reluctant interest, crossed the general's otherwise impassive face. "By stealing government property. By flying it," she corrected, her tone precise. "By proving that my skills, my knowledge, and my ability are not determined by the prejudices of a broken evaluation system." Behind the general, one of the colonels murmured something under his breath, earning a sharp glance that silenced him instantly. No one else spoke. The gravity of what was happening had pressed the entire base into a suspended moment, like time itself was holding its breath. The general took one step closer, boots thudding with the finality of a gavel. "You are aware that your actions constitute multiple violations of military code, federal law, and national security regulations." "I am," Emily answered. "So fragile they couldn't stop me. I'm also aware that the same systems designed to keep me out, where a ripple went through the officers. Davidson's jaw worked like he was grinding teeth into dust, but no one interrupted. "You don't get to justify breaking the law because you're angry," the general said, his voice dropping into a tone that would have made lesser men tremble. "You don't get to compromise security protocols because you believe you were wronged." "No," Emily agreed, lifting her chin. "But I do get to expose that the safeguards you trust can be undone by someone with a wrench, a maintenance manual, and the determination you all pretend only certain people are allowed to have." The words struck the air like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. Somewhere across the field, a wrench dropped from a stunned technician's hand, clattering against concrete like a gunshot. Then the general removed his sunglasses. His eyes were piercing, a blue so sharp it felt like being dissected under a scalpel. He studied her, searching for something. Weakness, regret, maybe even the flicker of uncertainty. But there was none. Her gaze held steady, unflinching. Davidson shifted his weight, clearing his throat, ready to step in, but the general raised a hand to silence him. His voice, when it came again, was lower, edged in steel. "You flew it. Solo." "Correct." "Started it without technical clearance." "Correct." "Took off under live base conditions, no incident." "Correct." "And landed it, intact, undamaged." "Correct." The general's nostrils flared slightly. "That's impossible." Emily's lips curved, not quite into a smile, but something colder. "Apparently not." The general turned slowly, taking in the faces of everyone present, officers, cadets, ground crew, military police, all now frozen in a tableau of disbelief, admiration, confusion, and in more than a few cases, a dawning sense that they were witnessing the kind of moment that would be told and retold long after every one of them was gone. "Colonel Davidson," the general said, his voice now calm, controlled, but with the undertone of a man reordering entire chessboards in his mind. "Escort Miss Carter to conference room 1. Secure her. No cuffs, no guards, no dramatics." Davidson blinked. "Sir, no debates." The general's eyes cut back to Emily. "And prep the boardroom. Notify the Inspector General, Command Legal, and the Director of Advanced Flight Programs." His gaze swept back across the tarmac, voice rising just enough to carry over the stunned crowd. "This base is now on operational lockdown until further notice. No takeoffs, no landings, no communications beyond command clearance." A stunned murmur spread like a shockwave. Then, without another word, the general turned on his heel, walking back toward the convoy with a finality that felt less like a retreat and more like the calm before a storm of meetings, decisions, and consequences that would ripple far beyond the perimeter of this airfield. And just like that, the entire base ground to a halt. Not because of enemy action, not because of war, because a single woman they said did not belong had stepped into their sky and forced the world to stop and look. The conference room was sterile, suffocating and heavy, with an unnatural silence that seemed more oppressive than any shouting could ever be. The polished oak table in the center gleamed beneath the cold glare of fluorescent lights, surrounded by chairs that seemed deliberately uncomfortable, designed to remind anyone seated there of their place in the hierarchy. Emily sat alone at one end, hands folded back straight, her expression carved from stone. Across the table, the general sat flanked by 2 high-ranking legal officers and a representative from the Inspector General's office. Their faces were unreadable, a perfect wall of military discipline, but behind their carefully neutral expressions was something sharper, a war of conflicting instincts. On one hand, protocol demanded this be treated as a violation, a breach of the highest order. On the other, reality refused to conform to expectations. Reality had delivered them something no regulation had ever anticipated. Colonel Davidson lingered against the back wall, arms crossed, his face betraying nothing of the swirling conflict in his mind. Captain Reynolds was conspicuously absent, removed from the situation entirely, whether by command or self-preservation, no one knew. The general leaned forward, resting both forearms on the table. His fingers tapped once, twice, then stopped. His gaze bored into Emily's as if sheer force of will could extract answers no interrogation ever could. "Let's be perfectly clear," he began, his tone as sharp as the blade at his hip. "You have placed this installation, this aircraft, and national security into a state of unprecedented jeopardy." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm aware. You initiated a full system override on one of the most advanced fighter platforms in the world. Yes, you bypassed protocols, started it, taxied it, and took it into the air, without clearance, without backup systems enabled, and without authorization." "Correct. Then landed it with a level of precision we have documented pilots failing to achieve under controlled conditions." "Correct." The general's lips pressed into a line so thin it practically vanished. One of the legal officers shifted, tapping notes onto a tablet, while the representative from the Inspector General's office watched Emily as though she were a puzzle whose pieces did not fit. The general's voice dropped, more dangerous for how quiet it became. "Explain to me how." Emily's fingers curled slightly against the table's edge. "Because your system assumes that knowledge only lives inside the people you choose to let in. Because it assumes that authority creates competence. It doesn't." The IG representative finally spoke, his voice more clinical, more detached. "Miss Carter, regardless of personal grievances, what you performed was, on paper, impossible. The F-22's startup sequences are classified. Avionics require multi-layer authentication. There are safeguards that should have prevented this." She nodded once. "They're only safeguards if they're designed by people who understand how someone thinks when the door is locked. In their face. You all built security for insiders, not outsiders. I've been an outsider my entire life. I know how to find the cracks." The general sat back, steepling his fingers. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a motion so subtle, it barely registered, he slid a file forward, a thick red-bordered folder stamped with multiple clearance seals, the kind of file that lived in vaults, not offices. "This is your file," he said. "Metrics, it tells a story. Training evaluations, psychological assessments, performance." Emily's jaw clenched. "A story someone else wrote. Her." Mouth curled, not into a smile but something colder, uncomfortable. Translation: "I made the wrong people." The legal officer to his left interjected, tapping the tablet. "Miss Carter, regardless of how unfair or biased that evaluation process may have been, none of it justifies breaching military security." Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping into something sharper, quieter. "Then tell me, what does justify it? If you watched a system perpetuate failure, if you saw it gatekeep talent, suppress innovation, and waste potential because someone didn't look the way it expected, what would you do?" The table fell into silence. The question hung heavier than the threat of any reprimand. Then the general reached into the folder again, extracting a single sheet of paper, sliding it toward her. This complicates things further." Emily glanced down, her breath caught. It was a request, signed 2 months before her dismissal, a formal recommendation for her removal, filed by Captain Reynolds. Her eyes snapped back up. "On what grounds?" Davidson, silent until now, pushed off the wall, his arms dropping to his sides. "On grounds that he believed you were a liability to unit cohesion. He argued, and I quote, that your obsessive focus on mechanical systems detracted from your ability to operate effectively within a team dynamic." Emily barked a sharp, humorless laugh. "Then half the instructors." "I was a liability because I understood the aircraft better." Davidson's jaw tightened. "I didn't agree. My counter-request to retain you was overruled." Her eyes narrowed. "You fought it?" "I did," the general interjected, voice ironclad. "None of this changes the immediate situation. We have a breach." "A breach?" "The Pentagon is already aware of. Their first question will be whether this was an act of sabotage or a demonstration." Emily leaned back, folding her arms. "Depends on whether you learned anything." Silence. Then the general stood. His chair scraped back, a harsh grating sound that cut through the heavy air like a blade. "The simple truth is this. You have demonstrated a level of technical mastery, operational nerve, and systems understanding that we have not seen in any pilot candidate in the last decade." The legal officer's head snapped up. Sir, not done, the general barked, shutting him down. His gaze snapped back to Emily. The political fallout will be enormous. There will be hearings, there will be reviews. But here in this room, the decision I make will determine whether you leave in handcuffs, you would, or with wings. Every eye in the room shifted to Emily. The general's next words were slow, deliberate. You proved that the systems meant to keep people out can be beaten, because they were built on assumptions about who's worthy to fly. Assumptions that you destroyed, but in doing so, you also proved something else. You proved that you can operate under pressure, improvise beyond standard doctrine, and think at a systems level most pilots never reach. His hands folded behind his back. So here's the decision. If you agree, we recommend immediate enrollment in the advanced flight program, classified, no public record, no headlines, no articles, just training. Real training, no politics, no old biases. Emily didn't breathe. The general's gaze sharpened. Or, we charge you. Grand theft, military property. Espionage-level breach, career over, life likely over. Silence. No one in the room moved. No one so much as shifted in their seat. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Her answer, when it came, was clear as thunder. I'll fly. The words lingered in the air longer than seemed possible, as though reality itself was taking a moment to process them. I'll fly. 3 syllables that detonated through every rigid wall of protocol, tradition, and assumption that had governed. The room, the base, and the entire institution standing behind it. For a beat, no one moved, no one even breathed. Then, like gears snapping back into motion after a jam, the machine of military bureaucracy began grinding forward once more. But something fundamental had shifted. The general's eyes remained locked on Emily, searching, calculating. Not for doubt, there was none of that, but for understanding. For the depth of what she had just committed to, and perhaps deep beneath the polished steel of his demeanor, a grudging respect was beginning to take root, though he would never allow it to show. Very well, he said at last, his tone as heavy as the weight of the decision itself. He straightened, hands clasped behind his back. Effective immediately, Emily Carter. You are enrolled into the advanced flight program under sealed orders. You will report to Skunk Division, designation Echo Black. This assignment supersedes all prior evaluations, discharges, and records. Your existence in this program does not exist in any public or standard military record. One of the legal officers shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth as if to object, but the general cut him off with a single sharp glance that flattened the air in the room. There will be no further discussion, he snapped. Not here. Not anywhere. Davidson inhaled slowly, visibly processing the magnitude of the shift. His arms were still crossed, but something about his posture softened. Not entirely. Not enough to betray the rigid command presence he had worn for decades, but enough that his gaze now carried something different when it landed on Emily. Not hostility, not skepticism. Something closer to acknowledgement, or perhaps the beginning of reconciliation with the truth he could no longer deny. The general continued, voice lower, but no less absolute. There is a vehicle waiting outside this building. You will board it. It will take you to a classified hangar facility. From this moment forward, you answer only to Echo Black Command. Your prior history, your dismissal, your evaluations, your records cease to exist. He stepped closer, lowering his tone until only Emily could truly hear him. But understand this, what you did today was not a victory. It was an opening salvo. You have earned the right to prove yourself, but nothing more. You step 1 inch out of line and not even God will find the pieces. Emily met his gaze without flinching. I wouldn't expect anything less. The general stepped back, dismissed. A subtle nod from one of the MPs was the only signal needed. The door opened. 2 security officers, no longer guards, but escorts, stepped in and waited. No restraints, no weapons drawn, just a silent invitation to follow. Emily stood. Her chair scraped against the floor, echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. She turned toward the door, but not before letting her eyes flick briefly toward Davidson. His mouth pressed into a grim line, then gave a single, almost imperceptible, nod. A gesture not of approval nor of congratulations, but of recognition. a simple, silent acknowledgement of truth. She walked past him without breaking stride. The hallway outside was quiet, stripped of the chaos that had engulfed the airfield earlier. As Emily walked, personnel who had once cast skeptical glances her way now looked at her with expressions that were harder to pass: confusion, uncertainty, maybe even something bordering on admiration, though few would ever admit it aloud. The SUV waiting outside was matte black, unmarked, its tinted windows reflecting nothing. The driver did not speak as she climbed in. The doors locked with the finality of an airlock sealing shut. The vehicle pulled away from the conference building, cutting a clean line across the base's perimeter toward a direction she had never been allowed to explore before. As the airfield shrank behind her, Emily leaned back into the seat, letting the weight of what had just happened press into her ribs like a second heartbeat. Her mind spun, not with doubt, but with rapid calculations. What Echo Black was, what came next, what systems, protocols, and expectations would be waiting. It wasn't fear, not even anticipation, it was focus. The singular, razor-edged focus of someone who had walked through every locked door placed in her path and knew instinctively that the next one would be even heavier, even more fortified. 45 minutes later, the vehicle turned off the main service road, passing through a security checkpoint so heavily armed, it looked less like an access gate and more like the front line of a war zone. Guards with biometric scanners, encrypted badges, and shoulder-slung rifles barely glanced at the vehicle before waving it through. Past the checkpoint, the road descended into a tunnel that swallowed all natural light. The world outside disappeared. When the vehicle stopped, it did so inside a cavernous hangar that looked nothing like the sterile order of the main base. This place was raw, industrial. Shadows clung to the steel beams overhead. The air smelled of jet fuel, ozone, and something else, something sharper, like the bite of pure electricity. Waiting at the bottom of the ramp was a figure in a flight suit that bore no insignia, no rank. Just a single patch over the left breast pocket, Echo Black. He stepped forward as the driver exited the SUV and opened the door for Emily. His face was lean, angular, his eyes the color of gunmetal. His posture radiated the kind of calm confidence that could only be forged in places where failure wasn't an option but a death sentence. "You're Carter," he said, not a question. "I am." "I read the file." His voice was as crisp as a snapped cable. Had to be exaggeration. Then I watched the footage. Didn't believe half of it. Thought it. Emily crossed her arms. Still think it was exaggeration? A shadow of something like a smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth. Write it big enough. "No, I think they didn't." He extended a hand. "Now. Call sign Vector. Lead Systems Officer for Echo Black. You're with me." She gripped his hand without hesitation. His grip was firm, steady, unflinching. "Let's get one thing clear," Vector said, releasing her hand but never breaking eye contact. "You're not here because someone gave you a second chance. You're here because you broke the system so badly, they had no choice but to rewrite the rules around you." "Good," Emily replied, "because I'm not here to play by their rules." Vector nodded once. "Welcome to the real game." As he turned, leading her deeper into the hangar, the shadows parted just enough to reveal the silhouettes of aircraft, unlike anything she had ever seen. Sleek, black, angles so sharp they seemed to slice through the air even while standing. Still, prototypes, ghost projects, machines that technically did not exist. Emily's pulse quickened, not with fear but with the undeniable certainty that this was where she had always been meant to be. The truth could not be ignored anymore. Not by them. Not by her. The hangar swallowed Emily whole as she followed. Vector into its depths, every step echoing against the steel walls and concrete floors. Overhead, massive industrial lights flickered to life in sequence, revealing shapes that seemed ripped from the edge of imagination. Aircraft lined the floor, their silhouettes sharp, sleek, and predatory. Machines crafted not just for flight but for dominance in a sky where no rules applied. Some were aircraft in the strictest sense, wings, fuselages, jet intakes, but others defied even those familiar patterns. Delta wing frames with no vertical stabilizers, V-shaped hulls with skins so matte they seemed to absorb the very concept of light. And at the center, resting on a cradle of reinforced scaffolding, sat a jet unlike anything Emily had ever seen. A fusion of aerodynamics, stealth, and raw aggression, its surfaces seamless, its lines impossibly fluid. Vector walked without speaking, expecting her to keep up, and she did. Her boots thudded a steady cadence against the ground as her eyes darted from machine to machine, drinking in details, cross-referencing a lifetime of technical knowledge against forms that shattered every assumption. They arrived at a workstation, built into the corner of the hangar, a wall of monitors, schematics, and real-time data feeds arranged in a display of controlled chaos. Vector gestured to one of the larger monitors, where a 3D rendering of the aircraft at the center of the hangar rotated slowly. "This," he said, voice dropping into a tone that carried both pride and gravity, "is the VX-9 Phantom, next-generation air superiority platform. Technically doesn't exist. Officially doesn't exist. You're one of the 6 people cleared to even know its name." Emily stepped closer, her breath hitching, not with nerves, but with the kind of anticipation that vibrates beneath the skin. "It's fully functional?" Vector's lips curved into a grin that was anything but friendly. "Functional enough that it needs someone crazy enough to fly it. Congratulations, you just became that someone." She absorbed the data flooding the screen, engine output ratings beyond anything conventional. Control systems so advanced they replaced redundancy with self-healing algorithms, composite skin that responded to airflow in real time to adjust. Drag coefficients. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a living weapon. "How fast?" she asked. Vector chuckled. "Faster than anything you've ever seen, faster than anything anyone has ever seen, period. Hypersonic capable, but speed's the least of its tricks." He tapped a control. The schematic shifted, highlighting the Phantom's stealth profile. It doesn't just avoid radar, it scrambles it. To anyone watching, it looks like a flock of birds, or a weather anomaly, or sometimes nothing at all. Emily's pulse thrummed. "And weapons?" Vector's eyes glinted. "Let's just say if you can see it, it's already too late." He turned toward her fully. "You're not here for training in the traditional sense. You've already proven you can fly better than anyone they threw at you. You're here because this thing needs someone who doesn't think inside the rules. Someone who understands the machine as an extension of themselves. Someone the old system never wanted, but now can't survive without." Emily nodded once, sharp, precise. "When do I start?" "You already did the moment you stepped into this hangar," Vector replied. He tapped his comm. "Control, prep Phantom for taxi. Fuel full, systems check. Notify ops we're going hot." A voice crackled back. "Confirmed. Phantom moving to line 2. Vector looked back at her. "Suit up." A door behind the workstation opened, revealing a locker room that looked more like the prep area for a deep space mission than any flight deck Emily had ever seen. Suits hung in climate-controlled cases, sleek, black, layered with composite, fibers that shimmered slightly under the lights. Helmets sat on mounts beside them, visors reflecting the room in distorted, ghostly curves. She stepped forward, fingers tracing the smooth lines of the flight suit as a technician approached with a tablet. "Vitals?" he asked. Emily held out her arm without hesitation. The tech pressed the scanner to her wrist, nodded at the reading, then keyed her data into the system. "Suit calibrating," he said. "It'll sync to your biometrics. You won't notice the exo assist unless you pull more than 9 Gs. She slid into the suit. The interior hugged her form instantly, micro-actuators tightening in response to her movement, distributing pressure evenly. It wasn't just a flight suit, it was a survival system, an interface between her body and the brutal realities of physics. When she clipped the helmet into place, the visor flickered to life with a HUD sharper and more intuitive than anything she'd seen before. No clutter, no lag, just data when she needed it, and silence when she didn't. By the time she stepped back into the hangar, the Phantom was already moving, its landing gear rolling smoothly toward the taxi line. Technicians peeled away as it passed, their heads down, their focus absolute. No words, no ceremony, just the execution of a mission that didn't exist. Vector stood by the access ladder, one hand resting against the fuselage. "One rule," he said as she climbed. "There are no rules. You figure it out up there, or you don't come back." Emily settled into the cockpit. Her hands ran across the controls, minimalistic, elegant. Where the F-22 had been a cathedral of switches and toggles, this was a meditation chamber. Controls appeared as her fingers hovered near them, projected holographically in response to intention as much as motion. "Phantom Control, this is Ghost One." Vector's voice filtered through her headset. "Yours if you want it." "Call sign is..." Emily smiled beneath the visor, the weight of everything behind her. The rejection, the dismissal, the fight, coalescing into a singular, perfect point of focus. "Ghost One," she confirmed. "Clear to taxi." The engines spooled. A low hum grew into a predatory growl. As the taxi lights flicked green, Emily eased the throttle forward. The Phantom moved, smooth as silk, its frame responding like muscle memory made manifest. Tower clearance wasn't a concern. This wasn't a flight anyone was supposed to know about. The runway lights flickered once, then dimmed. Whether from coincidence or control override, she didn't know. Or care. Throttle to 50%, brake hold, systems check, throttle to 80, brake hold. "Ghost One, systems green," came Vector's voice. "When ready. Throttle full, brake release." The Phantom surged forward, acceleration so brutal it shoved her back against the seat, despite the exosuit's compensation. The airspeed tape climbed, 200 knots, 300, 500. At 600, she pulled. The wheels left the earth. Gravity fell away. The sky unfolded. And as the Phantom shot into the stratosphere, climbing faster than anything that had ever been built, the weight of the past burned away behind her like vapor trails. She was no longer someone they doubted, no longer someone they dismissed, no longer someone anyone could ignore. She was Ghost One now, and the sky was hers.